Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my NACL Week 2 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. Love covering the NACL every single week on this channel. It's been a pretty fun split to start off so far. I think kind of the condensed nature of the league, now that there's only 10 teams instead of 16, definitely makes it more intriguing every single day. Everybody is playing, and matchups are a lot more frequent, and so we're really starting to see a lot of these teams, even some of the bottom teams, really compete. There really hasn't been anybody that has been underperforming up till this point this year. Everybody's been relatively competitive, so it's been pretty fun to watch. But of course, I want to know what you guys thought down in the comment section below. What teams were impressing you this week, and what teams were maybe not living up to the expectations maybe that you had for them. It was a pretty wild week, especially in terms of results and in terms of showings that maybe didn't correlate all that much with week number 1. So definitely some thoughts and opinions, but I'd love to hear you guys down in the comments section below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. Of course, if you're new here, what we're going to do is have a graphic up for each of the 3 days in week number 2 here with all 5 games on it. We're going to be going through all 5 in relatively short detail. Hopefully try to keep this around an hour-long video, going over my player of the game, my dud of the game, and then at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week, a dud of the week, and I will be going over my updated power rankings for everything. So let's go ahead and kick off with day number 1. Up on the screen right now, you're going to see all the results for day number 1, but we got to kick it off with our first slate of games, and our first game in our first slate of games was going to be AoE Gold taking on FlyQuest Challengers, and FlyQuest picks up the 2-0 best of 2 win, which is really, really good for them. Really needed to see this team continue to kind of push forward, I would say. It was an up and down week number 1 against really good teams. They basically only played good teams in week number 1, and they looked good doing it, and you know, we were a little bit concerned about maybe some regression coming in from some of these players. Spearx didn't exactly have the most dominant week number 1, but a lot of the things that we saw out of this team were very comforting, I think, for FlyQuest fans and just their expectations moving forward in general. My player of the series is going to go to Masu, although this was up in the air between him and Yuji, who continues to play at a really high level. We'll talk about him in a second, but really glad to see Masu kind of bounce back. Not that he had a bad week 1, we were kind of waiting for him to be, like, definitively the best AD carry in the league. I think that's kind of the expectation that a lot of people had for him going into the split was, okay, him and Winsome are just, like, the best bot lane. They're going to win every game. Masu's going to dominate the competition, and in a year, he's going to be a superstar in the LCS, right? That's kind of the expectation I think we all had for a player like Masu. It was a little bit more bumpy in week number 1. Not that it was bad. Again, I don't want it to come across like he had a bad week 1. He didn't. He just wasn't as, like, overwhelmingly dominant as maybe he was at points last split, but this was a really good showing. Going into an AoE team that, you know, we'll talk about it in a bit, but really didn't look all that good in this series with the exception of one player. It was good to see Masu step up and actually be able to perform against a team that he should be able to kind of dominate in the same way that he did last split. And then Yuji, I thought, also was really good, and honestly, Yuji's been this team's best player to start this split. He was unreal in week number 1, definitely the catalyst for a lot of the aggressive plays that they wanted to make, and he was really good in this series as well. Obviously, Will on the other side of the map was also pretty fantastic for AoE. The jungle matchup was very back and forth, but Yuji's aggressiveness has really pushed the tempo of this team along a lot faster, and I think it really does benefit them quite a bit. It certainly benefits his playstyle, and so for Masu and Yuji, I feel like they were the big standout members. Of course, Winsome, I thought, still had a pretty good series, and everybody on FlyQuest played well. I think Spearx definitely played a little bit better than he did in week number 1, where I thought he was a little bit up and down, but overall, FlyQuest is a scary team, and I certainly wouldn't want to run into them in the league. And then for AoE on the other side, my dud of the series is going to go to Concept, but realistically, this can go to quite a few people. Concept was just the player that I think played bad in both games, where I think there were players in both game 1 and game 2 that were worse than Concept, but he was the kind of constant over the course of the series that wasn't particularly good, and so for me, he gets dud of the series. But really, this is like the whole AoE team. Darkwings, Lynx, like, they were not good. Their carry roles were just not stepping up, and that's going to be a little bit of a problem. Breezy wasn't exactly contributing all that much. Really, the only player on AoE that was having a positive series overall was Will, and he had a great series. I mean, the dude almost 1v9 hard carried game number 2. It was actually insane, and Will is definitely looking like the player that he was promised to be coming back here into the NACL and into Tier 2 in North America. If the rest of the team can shore up a little bit more, maybe get a little bit more consistent, because we know we've seen good things out of Darkwings, and this bot lane honestly had a great week 1. Breezy in particular, I thought, played really well in that first week of the split, so there are a lot of good things on AoE, but Will might be the only player that can stand up and actually continue to play at a super high level against teams like FlyQuest challengers, who are one of the best teams in the entire league. And so, good and bad, I would say, coming in from AoE, but at the end of the day, you know, the loss isn't too surprising here. But for Fly, really nice to be able to pick up the 2-0 victory, and especially because it really does feel like a lot of the players that we wanted to see step up are stepping up right now. And then moving on to our second of the first slate of games here. This one was a really interesting matchup between two teams that really looked good in the first week of this split. We had Disguised taking on Evil Geniuses Challengers, and it was a 1-1 split. EG continuing to prove that they are a team that absolutely needs to be taken seriously. And honestly, I thought both teams played really well in this series. Both teams had members of their team that I think looked really solid. I would say Disguised maybe was a little bit more consistent, but you could argue that Evil Geniuses looked really, really good in game number 2, even if they kind of got blasted in that first game. And so, relatively good stuff from both teams overall. My player of the series is going to go to Tomio in the jungle against his former organization, and I really do think he's been very good to start this split. He's mostly been on engagers, mostly been on things that are going to try and set up the rest of the team, but I think he plays that role at a very high level, a very versatile player. I think people kind of recognize him as more of a carry-oriented jungler from his time on Evil Geniuses, but he is much more of the, of a facilitator than people give him credit for. He can be someone that makes the rest of his team, you know, look really good and have opportunities to be able to show off a lot of their skills, and that's one of the reasons I think that most people consider him to be one of the best, if not the best jungler in the NACL at the current moment. He had another really good series here, definitely the better jungler, and I think he just sets up DSG so well. He sets up a lot of these players to be able to play well. What I've really been impressed with when it comes to DSG in particular is how they played around topside, though. As good as Tomio has been, his synergy with Fake God has actually been incredibly impressive, and the fact that Fake God has been winning 1v1 so consistently, I think gives DSG a lot of prio on that side of the map for Tomio to be able to play for other lanes as well. And so Young, I think, benefits a lot from that. Meech, I think, benefits a lot from that. Young, in particular, I think, really likes having that prio on the top side so that he can play a lot more aggressive, and I think Tomio definitely capitalizes off of that. But like I said, Fake God also had a really good series, and again, he's probably been the most consistent member of DSG across the first couple of games here. Just been really, really good for them. I honestly felt like I was going to get some flack for putting Fake God as the #1 top laner moving into the split, but he has done nothing but prove me entirely correct on that. As good as Bradley has been, and we'll talk about Bradley, he continues to be a big positive for Team Liquid. Fake God has been like a different level in terms of what he's been able to offer in the top lane. Legitimately one of the most interesting players to watch in the entire league. Way too good for this level, and I understand that hasn't had the best of LCS success, but still is a very good player overall. But Evil Geniuses, on the other side, really not all that bad either. They were still able to take a game in this series, which I think is a really good thing, and even though I am going to give Shaden my dud of the series, I think he was probably the weakest member of Evil Geniuses, and really the only one that I felt was like actively losing pressure to the other side of the map in that game #2, which was, of course, Tomio, who I think had a really good series and just has really good pathing in general, and so I'm not going to like throw Shaden under the bus too much. I think he can still perform a lot better, and obviously expectations for him are still crazy high, even after a really disappointing spring split. We know he has the talent, and we've seen what he can do when he's really on fire. We already saw that in week #1. He still is the player that I think we all had high expectations for, but I think we're really going to have to start settling into the idea that he's just never going to be consistent unless he's got really good talent around him that's going to be able to propel him forward. But I honestly really like the carry duo for Evil Geniuses, and I thought they played really well in this series. Both Ryoma and King, I think, had really good series overall, or really good game 2s in particular, kind of carrying them across the finish line. King has been very underratedly fantastic for this team. I was kind of going out on a limb and saying that King was going to be a pretty massive upgrade for this team. I wasn't going out on a limb saying he was going to be an upgrade. I was going out on a limb saying it was going to matter, right? That his addition to this team is going to propel them back up into where they should have been all along, which is near the top of the standings. And so far, that has kind of been the case. They've been able to go toe-to-toe with good teams like Disguise. They've been able to take down the worst teams in the league. Like, it's good stuff, and I think King has been a big reason why. His consistency over the beginning part of the split has been very good, even if he wasn't perfect in game #1, but Evil Geniuses in general were not perfect in game #1, and I think Ryoma, when he plays well, you know, him and Shaden are both so finicky in terms of what you're going to get from them game to game, but when both of them play well, like, this team is going to be relatively unstoppable, because Ryoma from ahead is maybe the scariest mid laner outside of APA to face in the entire league, and so, good stuff overall from Evil Geniuses. You can see the positives, even if, you know, their inconsistencies in game #1 were definitely a little bit concerning. Shaden definitely needs to clean up some of the mistakes and some of the pathing choices, but overall, I think EG is looking good, and right now, I think they've firmly planted themselves, at least after day #1, into the top 4. And then Disguised on the other side, we know what they are. I'd like to see them win some series 2-0 against some of these top teams, but being able to win game 1 as dominantly as they did and keep up in game #2, they were the more consistent team, and I think that's a really good thing to see from them here. And now we move into our second slate of games here on day number 1, and we kicked our second slate off with probably the matchup of day number 1 that I was most intrigued in seeing. We had Cincinnati Fear taking on Team Liquid Challengers, and TL does take the 2-0 series win, kind of continuing both of the trends that these teams have set over the start of this split so far, with Team Liquid really pretty definitively looking like the best team in the NACL, and Fear honestly starting out a lot colder than I think a lot of people expected, and that was the case in this series. Not to say that Fear really should be going toe-to-toe with a team like Team Liquid. They're just in ridiculous form right now. They are very clearly the best team in the NACL, and that's not like a flame to Fear. It's not a flame to Disguise. It's not flame to FlyQuest. It's not flame to any of the other teams that are in that area. Team Liquid is just a really freaking good League of Legends team at the current moment, and they're playing at a very high level. This bot lane in particular continues to be a massive positive for them. My player of the series is going to go to Arrow, although it was very close. I will definitely give you that. There were many moments where I wanted to give player of the series to Mir in the jungle, who I think was also phenomenal for this team, and we'll talk about him in a second, but I really do think that the bot lane stepping up and being as consistently good as they have been over the course of the beginning of this split is a big reason why Team Liquid is so dominant. Like, Mir and APA are the best jungle mid duo in the league. I don't think a lot of people are really going to dispute that at the moment. They're just absolutely unstoppable in their current form. They're just really, really good as a duo. Bradley was a lot of people's #1 top laner coming into the split, and he's been good, even on weak side, for most of this split, which is a really big positive for him. But Arrow and Kim Down stepping up and being one of the scarier bot lane duos in the entire league, at least to start this split, that's what separates Team Liquid, I think, from the rest of the teams. They don't really have a weakness. They don't really have a weak link. Obviously, Arrow's one of those players who, if you surround him with good talent, is probably going to look incredibly solid, but we saw moments last split where he was kind of bad as well. He was good last split. Like, I don't want to say that he was a bad player last split, but he was a little bit more inconsistent, I think, than people gave him credit for. And I think he really has not been. Every single game that Team Liquid has played over the beginning part of this split, Arrow has been pretty fantastic. They've only lost one game through their first 4 series, which is actually absurd. And so Arrow and Kim Down stepping up and having another really good series here, I think, is a really big reason why Team Liquid is doing so well. And then, like I said, Mir also had a phenomenal series. He's the best jungler in the league. Him and Tomio just feel like a slight edge over everybody else, if I'm being entirely honest. Yuji's playing well. I think Will is a really interesting player. There are a lot of really interesting junglers in the league, but man, like, the way Mir plays, it's just so dynamic. He's able to set his laners up to dominate more so than almost any other jungler in the entire league. He can carry games, but really what he does at such a high level is make sure players like APA, make sure players like Bradley, and this split so far, make sure players like Arrow have all the tools that they need in order to carry games themselves, and I think he does it, you know, just as good as anybody. It was just a really good series for Team Liquid, and they continue to look great. And then for Fear on the other side, they just continue to struggle to start this split. Now, strength of schedule has been a little bit of a problem for them, but even against the teams that they should be beating 2-0, they've not been able to pick up those victories. In particular, I think that Perry has taken a little bit of a step back in the early part of the split. Now, again, he's faced a lot of good junglers to start this split off, and so I don't want to overreact to any sort of things that have happened, but he's going to get my dead of the series again here, and it's been a couple of up and down series, I would say, for him overall, especially in terms of tempo. That's something that Fear has just not been able to generate all that efficiently. Shochi was really good in game number 1, or week number 1, I should say, being able to generate that tempo out of the mid lane, but it just feels like by the time the mid game hits, Fear are either up or they're down, and they don't really have a lot of ways to get back into the game, and so hopefully that's just something that, you know, the new players get acclimated to the team and they fix a little bit. Maybe JJ gets a little bit more vocal, because it just feels like they need a little bit more direction in the mid game, and Perry, I think, just needs to be a little bit more aggro. Like, that's really what I want to see. I want to see the Perry that we had in Spring Split, where he was playing with a ridiculous amount of confidence, where him and Shochi were one of the scariest jungle mid duos in the entire league, and where it felt like everywhere Perry went, the team ended up benefiting, whether that was top, bot, mid, wherever, right? Perry just hasn't exactly been that takeover threat, I would say, to start the split. Now, obviously, he still has that in him. I'm not going to rule him out just because of a couple of games against good teams. If he can get that confidence back, I am more than confident enough in him as a player to be able to get back to the point that he was at in spring and even get better. It's just not exactly there at the current moment, or at least it hasn't been on stage. And then the other player is Manui, who I think has had a pretty rough start to the split. Not that he's been awful, I just don't think, again, that he's been able to hold up against the best bot laners and the scarier bot laners in the league. Now, again, another player that I think when he's playing with confidence is going to be a lot better. I really do think that that's the whole thing for Fear, is just trusting yourself and trusting your ability to win games like this. this. That was something that they really had towards the back half of last split. I consider it a big reason why they were able to make that playoff run. Confidence in playing with the aggressiveness that you can win games is really a big difference maker at this level, and I think that they can still get back to that. It just hasn't exactly been perfect to start the split, and so I don't want to, harp on them too much on this game because, again, Team Liquid's a really hard team to beat at all. They only have one loss through their first 4 series, but I do want to see Fear step it up over the back half of this week, and then for Team Liquid, they just look unstoppable at the current moment. Clearly the best team in the league, and if they can keep that up, they're going to be a lot of fun to watch. And then our other of the second slate of games here, we had Team Fish Taco taking on Wildcard Gaming, and Wildcard picks up the 2-0 series win, not dropping a single game to Taco, who honestly did look pretty good through the first week of the season, certainly better than I was expecting them to. They actually held their own against some good teams, including Disguised, in that first week, and so I was interested to see how this team was going to rebound, if they were going to be kind of a middle-of-the-pack team in the NACL this split, but Wildcard kind of showing that maybe some of the question marks that I was raising about them over the first week were a little bit over-eager. This team might be exactly who we thought they were. They're still going to be a team with relatively high highs and relatively low lows, but those high highs are definitely still there. This was a good series overall from them. Player of the series for me was actually kind of difficult because I think a couple players on Wildcard played at a really high level, but I'm going to give it to Lens in the bot lane. Felt like they really wanted to play through him in this series, and Donbray was actually really good. This bot lane in particular I think was just fantastic. I almost gave player of the series to Donbray, but I can only do so much with the Yuumi pick. Like, that's almost always going to disqualify you from getting player of the series for me, just in general, so sorry, Donbray. I think you played really well, but Lens ended up getting that award, but it is worth noting, Donbray is in for Wildcard. I never really brought that up on the channel, so Duo King is out, Donbray is in. I assume he will be the support until Isles is able to come over to the States, which I assume he will be able to do eventually this split, but Donbray actually played fantastic in this first series. Him and Lens seem to have really good chemistry, especially in the early 2v2. That's something I'm going to keep watching. If he can continue to be a big positive for Wildcard, if he can mesh with this team a little bit better than maybe Duo King did last split, I think that's going to be really, really big for this team, and this bot lane really passed the test in this first little showing for them. I think Spawn and NXI on the other side actually had a really good week 1. Spawn, more of that late game carry, but NXI was crazy aggressive in the early game in the first week, and honestly, they just didn't really have the opportunity to be as aggressive here, and I think you got to give this bot lane a lot of credit for that. And then Keel as well continues to just be a very good player. I know people are saying that, like, oh, he's only really good on his champions. Well, he's got a lot of champions that he's really good on, and so I don't really know if you can make that statement anymore. I just like Keel a lot. I think he's a really big facilitator for this team. I think him and Saligo have very good chemistry together. Saligo often taking more of a backseat role to make sure that his jungler can get into a relatively good position. What I compared them to last split was kind of a, I don't want to say a budget version, but kind of a similar role to what Niski and Elyoya are for Mad Lions. Obviously, they're not Niski and Elyoya, but kind of that same style of what they want to do of shove and roam, play for your jungle, and try to affect the whole map and really try to create chaos. I think Wildcard does that at a very high level, and I think they continue to be a very scary team to go into, especially when jungle and bot lane are stepping up, because I have a lot of faith that mid lane's going to be fine. Saligo's a very stable player, and Zamudo in the top lane has impressed me through the start of the split, especially with his mechanics, and so I like Wildcard. And then for Taco on the other side, dud of the series is going to go to Onat in the mid lane. Just wasn't really able to hold up this series, didn't have any sort of pressure, was not really relevant in any sort of team fights. I actually was kind of high on Onat after the first week. I thought he was being relatively undervalued by a lot of the community. He was clearly doing a lot of damage. He was clearly being relevant in a lot of team fights, but it just wasn't meant to be in this series in particular. It wasn't just his fault. I think Rosethorn also got out jungled quite a bit, especially in that second game where it really wasn't all that close. I want to give a big credit to Keel, like I said, for being able to take away a lot of the resources that mid-jungle duo on the side of Taco had, but as a unit, I just don't think that they're probably what we thought they were. They're a good team, a team that's going to be able to be relatively competitive, even against some of the top teams in the league, but one that maybe I don't think a lot of people would be expecting to take games off of top teams, right? Maybe a team somewhere around 7th, 8th, 9th, maybe not the worst team in the league, but a team that can be relevant. I think this jungle mid duo is going to hold them back from being like the best team in the league, not necessarily because they can't grow into that, but just because it doesn't feel like they're going to be that in this split. I still like the bot lane, especially when NXI is playing aggressive, and honestly, Lunacia in particular had a really good series. This was one of his better series of the year so far, which is kind of better than Zamudo. Very similar players in my opinion, and so good to see Lunacia step up, and I still think that can be a win condition for this team, but we talked about jungle mid being a question mark for them because of just how strong those two roles are in the NACL at the current moment, and I just don't think they've done enough over the beginning part to dissuade me from that. But like I said, for Wildcard, crazy team with a lot of of upside when they play well, especially when the bot lane is playing consistent like they are in this series. I think this team is going to be very dangerous because I trust Keel and I trust Zamudo to be like really crazy. Saligo's got a lot of consistency. He's going to be able to hold down the fort in the mid lane. He wins lane much more commonly than I think a lot of people give him credit for. And then Lens and Donbray, I think, were really good in this first series. If they can keep that up, Wildcard is going to be a good team. And then for our final game of day number 1, our final series of day number 1, we had a matchup between Supernova and Maryville University, a battle between two teams that I think have a lot to prove after week number 1, and both of them prove it to an extent. I'm definitely leaning more towards one team than the other after this, but it is a 1-1 draw coming in from both of them. Maryville able to take a very close game number 1, and Supernova just kind of dominating them in game number 2, and so definitely I think one team looking a little bit stronger in their win than the other, and it's not a particular surprise if you did watch week number 1. No flame to Maryville, but they didn't exactly start the hottest of any of the teams in the entire league. And Supernova had a couple of players that really impressed me in that first week, and honestly, they continued to impress me in this series. My player of the series is going to go to Quacker in the top lane. Early contender for most surprisingly good player in the entire league. I really wasn't like favoring Quacker all that much going into the split. People who watched my pre-split player rankings know that I ranked him as the number 10 top laner, and I was just like, I just really haven't seen anything on tape that really gives me a lot of hope that he's going to dominate at this level, but he's actually been super good to start this split for Supernova, someone who has consistently been able to win lane, consistently been able to translate those leads into, parts of the map that he can make really strong. Just really impressed with him, honestly. There aren't a lot of top laners that have been able to make the kind of impact that he's been able to make for this team, and if he keeps that up, Supernova is going to be a lot better than people expect. He was by far the better top laner in this series against Niles, who, yes, can be a little bit over-aggressive sometimes, but, he was really good in week number 1. Easily, I would say, the best or the second best player on Maryville across that first week. And so Quacker looking fantastic. I think the bot lane continues to be a positive for Supernova, which we kind of anticipated moving into the split. Sketch and Trevor are just two very experienced and very talented players. Trevor in particular, someone who I'm very high on, but Sketch continues to really capitalize on the advantages that his team is able to create very well. Really happy to see him back in the AD carry role. It feels like he's so much more comfortable playing ADC than he was playing support. I understand in terms of like pathway to playing time, why it might make a lot of sense to role swap to support, but I really do think he is a great AD carry prospect for this level, and he continues to show a lot of really good things. The mid-jungle duo, I think, has been positive for them overall, especially Music, who I like quite a bit. I think he's somebody who has quite a bit of upside. Robbie Bob still has some, I guess, convincing to do for me, but definitely has talent. We've seen it in CLOL. We know he's able to kind of win games at this level, and Maryville's a team that he's had a lot of experience facing off with recently, and so, even if I'm not, like, super sold on the mid lane just yet, I think Supernova has already exceeded basically all of the expectations that I had for them going into the split. This really isn't a bottom 1, bottom 2 team like I felt like they were pretty locked into being going into the split. A lot of these players have overperformed my expectations, and I'm really, really excited to see where they go from here. And then for Maryville, there's good and there's bad. I'm really glad they were able to take game number 1. It would have been disastrous if they lost 0-2 to Supernova. That would have been really, really bad, but a couple of these players still continue to step up and make these games a lot more interesting. Odd Orange in particular was really good in this series, definitely the best member of Maryville in my opinion, and he continues to kind of be that. I think he's a stable presence in the jungle. We were talking into the season about how Niles and Odd Orange were the players that I was the least concerned about in terms of being able to translate, and that's kind of been the case. We'll talk about Niles in a second, but Odd Orange has definitely, I think, been, good enough for this level. It's everybody else on this team. Get Back had a good game number 1, I should say, in their win, but remember, he was maybe the worst player in the NACL in week number 1. Again, I don't want to flame him too hard. It's his first ever week at this level, and, a lot of players can play bad in a couple of games and then bounce back, especially when they're developing, but wasn't particularly encouraging in week number 1, was pretty good on the Azir in game number 1 here. Liked what we saw from him there. And then Scary Jerry and Zyko. I like Zyko a lot as a player. Jerry has a lot of upside mechanically speaking, but man, when they lose, they just lose really hard. They lose harder, I would say, than almost any other bot lane in the NACL up until this point. And so there's definitely some concern to have there, but my dud of the series is going to go to Niles in the top lane, who honestly just got brutalized by Quacker in game number 2. Not just by Quacker, but basically by everybody on Supernova. This is kind of the thing with Niles, is he's either going to win or he's going to lose, and unfortunately in this game he ended up losing. That's going to be a little bit of a worry when it comes to him, but it's just one game. Again, I know Maryville hasn't exactly looked great to start the split, but they have talent on this team, and there's nobody at the NACL level right now that I don't believe in at all. Maybe just because they haven't started the best, that shouldn't mean we should write them off entirely. And then for Supernova, they actually have started pretty good, and they're definitely a team to keep an eye on. There are a lot of teams that I think are in this cluster of like, you know, good lower tier teams, maybe not going to compete for top 4, but teams that I think could win any given game, right? I think Supernova is absolutely in that, around number, 6, around number 7, even number 5, right? If things continue to go well for this team. A lot of those teams have a lot to prove, and I think Supernova has proven quite a bit more than maybe even some of the other teams above them. And then moving on from day number 1 to day number 2 now, the middle of the week here in week number 2, and we kicked it off with our first slate of games, headlined by a matchup that I actually commentated on my Twitch channel. Gonna plug that right now. Link to that's gonna be in the description. Most weekends, most days I'm gonna be on commentating some games from the NACL with my buddy Thomas Walsh, and they're going to be up on my Twitch channel. The link to that's gonna be down in the description below. You can go check it out if you want kind of live reactions to some of the plays that are being made, but our first series here was one that I did watch live on Twitch, so again, go hit that follow button if you want to see when I go live, but it was Maryville University taking on Wildcard Gaming, a battle of the red teams here in the NACL, and it was a 1-1 split from both. A really fun series, probably the most fun series of the entire weekend, just back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Neither team really separating themselves all that much from each other, but that made for some really good games and some really exciting endings, and honestly, I think both teams looked relatively good in this series. My player of the series, though, is going to go to Get Back in the mid lane for Maryville. I was very critical of him in week number 1, and I think I was fairly critical. I think that there were quite a few mistakes that he was making to start this split, but man, Static Shiv LeBlanc will fix a lot of problems. He was so good in both game 1 and especially that game number 2, even the one that they lost, that I just had to give him the player of the series. I think he was the most impactful player for both sides in this series, and that's a really encouraging thing. I was very vocal about the fact that I didn't want to judge him too harshly in terms of future outlook just based off the fact that he didn't exactly have the best of week 1s, and I think that definitely came into play here. I think that he showed an ability to be a primary carry for a team in this game, and I think that that was something we really wanted to see out of him. Wasn't the only player, I think, to play well in this series, but certainly was the one that I think played the most consistently well, especially in that game number 2, where I just think he was such a problem. It was so difficult to deal with it on the side of Wildcard. They did obviously end up dealing with it because of some fantastic team fights, but Get Back is going to get my player of the series. And then on the other side, honestly, like for Wildcard, a couple of really good players for them as well. I thought Zamudo, obviously, in game number 2, ends up winning that game for them with the Akshan team fight towards the back half of the game. He was dominating laning phase and really making a huge impact on the game as a whole, and being able to translate that into actively winning the game, getting, a triple kill and getting full revives towards the back half. It just goes to show the power of Akshan and that champion that, Zamudo is one of the players that would pull him out here in the NACL, and it's really good to see that. I think Keel played really well over the course of this entire series. Again, another really good game number 2 from him. Zamudo was a little bit inconsistent in game number 1, but I think for the most part, everybody played well in this series. I gave dud of the series to Donbray on the side of Wildcard because I think he could have been a little bit more active towards this series, but really, I have in my notes, for negatives, no one. I don't think anyone played bad. If I could not give a dud of the series, I would, because I genuinely think that everybody played relatively well, that no one deserves dud of the series in this one. I just think that there could have been a little bit more explosiveness coming out from that Wildcard support, and I think if they had that, I think the game would have been maybe a little bit easier in game number 1, but still, both of these teams performing incredibly well, both of them playing very fun, and I think we saw near perfect versions, or near best case versions of both of them in this series. And then we got kind of the opposite in the other first slate game here, as we had Supernova taking on Team Liquid Challengers, and this one was a little bit lopsided. Team Liquid's just way too freaking good. They are so clearly the best team in the NACL, and that was definitely a take of mine that I thought was going to get a lot of pushback. I didn't really see Team Liquid listed at number 1 in the preseason all that frequently. For a lot of people, we saw Disguised, we saw FlyQuest, we saw those two teams, I think, ranked consistently ahead of teams like Team Liquid, but I feel pretty proud to have said that I felt pretty confident that they were going to be the best team in the league, because so far, they have clearly been the best team in the league. Honestly, they feel a lot more like Cloud9 last split than they do like their own Team Liquid team, which obviously started streaking towards the back half and ended up making top 3, but really wasn't like the most dominant team in the entire league up until that point. This is a dominant team. This is a team that is winning basically everywhere, and that's the most impressive part. My player of the series is going to go 2, Arrow, again, in the bot lane, continues to be a massive strength for Team Liquid. He's playing probably the best league that he's played all year long. He went 17-0-12 in this series. I mean, he dominated both games. Bot lane has just been a massive problem for other teams having to play into them. There really hasn't been basically any lane that's been able to withstand Arrow and Kim down because Mir, I think, wants to expend a lot of pressure there. But even when he doesn't, like, their 2v2 has just gotten so much better and so much more consistent. One of the things that I was very vocal about last split was the fact that it felt like, yes, both Arrow and Kim down are good players, but it felt like they were good players at different times, where Arrow would have a really good stretch of games, and, you know, Kim down wouldn't exactly be playing at a high level then. And then Kim down would have a really good stretch of games, and then Arrow wouldn't exactly be playing well then. It feels like both of them are locked and loaded right now, kind of like they were in the playoffs, and I think that's by far the scariest version of this Team Liquid team that you could possibly have, with both of them playing at such a high level. Arrow has looked unstoppable and easily like the most dominant AD carry in the league up until this point, maybe with a couple exceptions, but I really do think it's been Arrow. And then APA is just so clearly the best mid laner in the region. Like, there are question marks, I would say, about pretty much every other mid laner in the region, some good, some bad, but not about APA. I mean, he's just so dominant. He wins every laning phase. He moves around the map. He can play that supportive style. He can play that carry style. He was definitely more of the facilitator in this series, but it helped this team. Arrow was super far ahead, and they just wanted to play for him, and so I mean, Team Liquid just feels unstoppable. They've got an MVP in the jungle spot. They've got one of the best top laners. Like, where is their weakness? I don't know. They're just way too freaking good. And then for Supernova, I still like them, but again, going up against Team Liquid, it's just a little bit too tall of a task for some of these players in particular. I think the jungle mid duo was certainly outclassed in this game, the more inexperienced members of this team. My dud of the series is going to go to Robbie Bob in the mid lane, who was just not nearly as good as APA. And that's a very difficult matchup to end up having to go into. I think Robbie Bob, a player who has been fine. I was worried about him going into the split in terms of what he was able to accomplish, just because none of his tape has really screamed like, wow, to me, other than the CLOL championships where he was really good. But what we've seen is that CLOL is not exactly the most comparable to the NACL that you can possibly get. There are obviously a lot of parallels. You know, Maryville has had good moments, but they've also been maybe the most inconsistent team in the league. And so Robbie Bob not exactly, you know, picking up the pace as quickly as possible isn't a surprise, but him versus APA just felt a little bit like a mismatch. And then Music, I thought, had probably his worst series of the year up until this point. Again, going into Mir, who is one of the most difficult junglers to actually generate any sort of leads against. I think it's not a huge surprise that Music wasn't able to keep up, but I think jungle mid was definitely a part of the map that I think was a little bit of a problem for Supernova. But it wasn't just them. Sketch and Trevor were fine. They were probably the best part of Supernova, but definitely worse than Team Liquid, and it's not like Quacker did anything in this series. And so, overall, I just think that they were a little bit outclassed, and that's not a surprise. We kind of knew that was going to happen. This was my number 1 team versus my number 10 team, at least in terms of talent, at the beginning of the split. Now, Supernova has certainly not performed to that bottom standard, but there is still a pretty big gap, I think, between these teams. So, Supernova shouldn't hang their head after this loss, and Team Liquid's just rolling right now. This is the best team in the NACL. They look relatively unstoppable, and if teams even take a game off of them, if they go 1-1, I think that a lot of teams in the league are going to be very happy about that. And then moving on to our second slate of games here on day number 2. This is kind of the section that I would like to call back and forth, because we would have some moments where both of these teams looked really good in both of these series. Starting with the first one, we've got Team Fish Taco taking on FlyQuest Challengers, and on paper, I think this looks like a relatively I guess you could say mismatched pair of opponents here, with Fly probably being pretty favored, but this was the first case of the 2 series that we'll talk about today where it's like one team performs great in one game and then the other team performs great in the other game, where it feels like both teams were just so dominant. It's honestly hard to get an idea of where either of them stand and which one was kind of the norm, but that was definitely the case in this series. Taco absolutely obliterating FlyQuest in that first game. I mean, utter demolition if we're being entirely honest, and then FlyQuest doing the exact same to Taco in the game after that. So both teams looking relatively good in the game that they would end up winning in this series, but both also looking pretty bad in the games that they would end up losing in this series. That made player of the series and dud of the series very difficult, because it didn't really feel like either team was good or many players were good over the course of the entire series. But for me, my player of the series is going to go to Winsome on the side of FlyQuest. Thought he was the most consistent. I know people are really talking about Masu towards the end of that game too with the Ezreal plays, and yes, I completely agree. Masu was really good on that Ezreal, but game 1 was very shaky from him, especially in terms of consistency, and so I did end up giving player of the series to Winsome, who I thought was a little bit better over the course of both games, especially on that Karma in game number 2, where not a lot of people are picking that thing up, and even less are having success on it, and I think Winsome just looked utterly dominant on that pick. I mean, it was doing everything you needed it to do. It made the Ezreal's life so much easier, not only because of the poke in lane, but because of the team fight potential as well, which is not something you often associate with Karma, and so Winsome I'm just really impressed by. He's the best support at this level, in my opinion, and he continues to show that. Masu was really good, though. I also want to give him a big shout out because he really was solid towards the back half of that game number 2. He was very close to getting my player of the series, specifically for those Ezreal plays. When he's on, again, he is the best AD carry in the region, mechanically speaking, but it's just been a little bit more inconsistent than I think it was last split, and I want to give a lot of credit to Winsome, who actually did have that consistency, I think, in my opinion, a little bit more so than getting credit for. And then for Taco, honestly, like, I'll just say this, the other players of the series here, all of Taco in game number 1, all of FlyQuest in game number 2. Like I said, these players looked really good in their respective wins, and that carried over. Like Rosethorn, Onat, dominant in game number 1. Game number 2, we'll talk about them. But same thing for FlyQuest. You know, we talked about Masu and Winsome, but, you know, even Yuji was phenomenal in game number 2, and there was just a lot of really good stuff coming out from both of these teams in their wins. It was the losses that was a little bit of a problem, and so dud of the series for me is going to go to Yuji because I thought his loss was the most noticeable in game number 1. He got jungled circles around by Rosethorn. It wasn't particularly close, and even if he did do relatively the same thing to Rosethorn in game number 2, I felt game 1 was just a little bit more noticeable in terms of like actual major jungle diff. I like Yuji. I think his aggressive style has been a huge boon to what FlyQuest has been able to do this year so far, but, you know, some of those games are going to go a little bit poorly, especially if the early game isn't as ideal as you would want it to be. And man, was that early game not very good from Yuji in game number 1. So he's going to end up getting dud of the series for me, but for Taco, I think you could realistically give it to Rosethorn, you could give it to Onat, because their game 2 was pretty miserable. Again, both of them played so well in the first game of the series that it's honestly hard for me to even mention that. We're talking like actually hard carry dominant kind of plays, but really that's just how it's going to be when you have a situation like this. Sometimes you're just not going to be able to keep up. But both of these teams looking relatively good in their wins. I don't really know what it means for either. I would have liked to see Fly be a little bit more dominant, but Taco's probably going to be walking out of the series, you know, with a 1-1, feeling pretty good and saying like we were hard on Disguise, you know, we took Fly 1 apiece. Like, we're actually a team that maybe some people need to start paying attention to, and I think that actually might be the case. And then for the second series of that second stretch there, we had another series where it was like, well, one team was good in one game, the other team was good in the other. We had AoE Gold taking on Disguised, and it was a 1-1 split, and like I said, another case of just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Disguised absolutely obliterated them in game 1, but, you know, as is now becoming accustomed to Disguised and this team in general, they kind of just forgot how to play the game in game number 2, where they took their foot off the gas. This is something that has become a little bit of a trend and a problem for them, is that they'll look really good in the first game, and then they'll try some shit out in game number 2 and end up losing it for no particular reason. Honestly, it reminds me a lot of Dignitas from last split, Dignitas Challengers, where it's like, man, you're just destroying people when you win, but you're also dropping games that you really don't have any sort of right to drop in the regular season. Dignitas did that a lot. Now, obviously, they figured shit out by the end of the year, and their talent was able to seep through, but Disguise definitely has a little bit of that in them, where it's just like a lot of 1-1 draws for a team that is as prioritized as they currently are. But we can go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Young in the mid lane. He was just really good, especially in that game number 1. I think he was the most consistent player across this whole series. This team very much wanted to invest into him in the mid lane. You know, a lot of people were really excited about him. He showed a lot of good things on Golden Guardians Challengers. Kind of funny, kind of going against his old organization in this matchup, but, you know, he was kind of a big hyped up prospect, especially with so much experienced talent around him. People were really looking forward to a potential breakout split for Young, and I was definitely a part of that camp. Obviously, I was very high on him last split, but I wasn't necessarily sure he was just going to click immediately into being one of the best mid laners. He's been pretty good to start the year, though. I don't think Disguised has done like a bad job, I should say, of overworking him. He's been put in a position where he can do the things that he's good at, and he's not really asked to do the things that he's not good at, which I think is really how you want to try and get these players accustomed to playing with each other. But he was definitely probably the most consistent member across this entire series. But I think for the side of Disguise, Tomio also had a really good series, especially again in that game number 1. I think jungle mid has been a positive for Disguise, even if it's not like the most dominant jungle mid in the entire league, because I still think that there are some that I feel a little bit more confidence in. But, you know, Tomio and Young are very, very solid, and I think that they were the positive for Disguised in the series. And then Lynx and Breezy were probably the positives for AoE, especially in game number 2. Lynx was really good across the series, but man, Breezy's been fantastic to start this split. You know, not really a lot of bad games coming out from him, and that's really positive. I've liked Breezy, obviously, for a long time as an ASU fan. You know, Forks Up. It's hard not to like Breezy. It's not hard to like him as a player, but he's very fun and he's very aggressive, and I think he fits this team really well. Him and Lynx have developed a nice chemistry, and Breezy's probably been, outside of Will, the best player on this team to start this split. And so AoE bot lane looking good, Disguise jungle mid looking good, but there were some negatives in this series. My dud of the series is going to go to Dark Wings, the mid laner for AoE. He's had good moments to start this split, but he's also had bad moments, very inconsistent to start Summer so far for me, and I like Dark Wings, but he's got to shore those things up, especially going up against players like Young, who, yes, Young's a very good player, but he's not someone who is, you know, you're going to get absolutely stomped by if you're not ready for him, right? You need to be prepared to be able to at least go toe-to-toe. Like, you have to be at least on a similar level to a player like Young with investment, and Dark Wings just wasn't that in this series, in my opinion, especially in that game number 1. Really, he's getting this for the Annie game in game number 1, where he just was really bad as a player. He was much better on the Azir in game number 2, significantly more useful, even if he wasn't the most useful player on the team, but he had the worst individual game, I would say, of anybody in this series with that Annie game in game 1. The other player you gotta shout out is going to be Fake God in the top lane in a negative light for Disguise. Probably the most inconsistent player. He pulls out the Aatrox in game number 2. Obviously, a pick that Fake God has gone to a lot over the course of his career because of his time on 100 Thieves. Him and Someday played that a lot, I imagine, in scrims. It was a big Someday pick. It was a big Fake God pick. And so, you know, really cool to continue see that here, but wasn't exactly working. Aatrox isn't in the best spot right now for competitive, and certainly wasn't the better top laner in that game. And I think a lot of people are going to point to him as a big negative, but I think Darkwing's game number 1 was just a little bit worse. I think Fake God had a little bit more redeeming qualities, even if he wasn't very good in that game number 2. So some ups and downs for both teams, but like I said at the beginning, you know, it usually goes to the team that has less expectations when you have a moment where both teams look relatively good. So AoE probably walking out of this with a 1-1 draw, feeling pretty damn good about it. And Disguised, even if Young and Tomio are starting to come together and have a really nice duo, and even if Disguised probably did look a little bit better across their entire series, they're probably going to be walking out of this wishing that they were able to take both games. And then the final series here of day number 2 was the one I was really excited to talk about, because we had Cincinnati Fear taking on Evil Geniuses Challengers, a couple of teams that I think are really fighting for that like 4 or 5 spot in the league, and Fear walking out with their first 2-0 series win of the year. Finally, we're seeing this team play up to the potential that we knew they had in them after that spring split. I put this team at number 4 in my preseason power rankings because I really did believe that they could, at their best, compete with the best teams in the league. It really hasn't started like that, but man, this is easily the most consistent series that they have played over the course of this year. They played with a lot of confidence, they played with a lot of aggression, and that's really what I wanted to see. Player of the series for me was a no-brainer in this one. It's going to go to Shochi in the mid lane for Fear. He has quietly been like one of the best mid laners in the entire league to start this split. I know Fear hasn't exactly looked great, but Shochi has consistently been able to win early and establish pressure in his lane. Now, it's not been every single game. There's definitely been some moments that haven't exactly been great, but when you're talking about a player that consistently is a positive for his team, Shochi is not brought up nearly enough in the conversation for a top 3 mid laner in the NACL at the current moment, and he's really been the best player on Fear in 2023 so far, in my opinion. I mean, Perry obviously in spring was awesome, but Shochi's just been the rock for them in terms of what they've been able to accomplish, and he's definitely been their best player in summer. And so I'm really happy to finally be able to talk about him and say, like, yes, he's playing really well, and he's a big positive for this team. I think Perry had a fantastic bounce-back series. That game number 2 on the Vi, he was super fed, absolutely deleting people. It's always fun to watch a Vi just dive into the backline and absolutely blow somebody up, especially when you have follow-up, but I really think that jungle mid duo is what's going to unlock the rest of this team. These are 2 of the best players in their roles in the entire region when they are playing at their best, and they have great chemistry together as a duo. If you can get back to that form, if you can get these guys playing with confidence and with aggression like they were in this game, like we've seen what they're able to do. Evil Geniuses is not a pushover of a team. They are incredibly talented and they've started the year relatively hot, but the Fear made them look like pushovers in this series. And so really impressed with that. I want to give a big shout out to Manui as well. His best series of the split by far, just very consistent damage coming out from them. I think that the bot lane in general was really underrated in this series. I know not a lot of people are bringing it up. You know, Perry and Shochi are definitely kind of the big conversation piece when it comes to Fear, but I think Manui was really, really good, and I think him and JJ definitely played their best 2v2s in this series, at least up until this point this year. Philip looked a lot more comfortable. It just felt like once this team had a comfortable lead, they felt a lot better at being able to execute on it. I think game number 2 in particular is one of the best games that we've seen Fear play in quite a while, and so very, very excited to be able to say that. And then for Evil Geniuses on the other side, there were some positives, but some negatives as well. I know I'm going to get called a homer for saying this, and I promise I try my best to make sure that I'm not biased biased when I say any of this stuff. I'm not just trying to uphold my predictions from the beginning of the split, but Ryoma was really good again in this series. As good as Shochi was, I think Ryoma also had some really good moments, and I know people are just going to say that I'm biased and that I'm trying to, justify my placement from beginning of split, but I think Ryoma's a really good player, and I think he's someone who continuously gets underrated by a lot of people. I think he makes a lot of good impacts around the map. I think he's a solid laner, and he's not really the one to give over, like, massive leads unless he's just, like, AFK running it down, which he does do sometimes. We saw that in week 1, but I thought he was really good in this series, or at least better than some of the other members of Evil Geniuses. My dud of the series is going to go to Soul in the top lane. I just can't remember a good play that he made. That Gragas game in game 2 just wasn't very good. There really wasn't a lot that he was actually able to accomplish. I know a lot of people are going to want to see King get the dud of the series for this one, and I understand. Like, King didn't play particularly great. He was definitely in consideration, but he had some moments and certainly was able to deal damage in some of these team fights, but it just wasn't going to be enough, and I definitely think his ability to not get outclassed in the 2v2 was a little bit not on display in this series, I guess, is the way. I probably could have worded that better, but that's how it's going to be in the video, so sorry about that. Yeah, King could have been better in lane, and I think that could have done a lot more for this team. Shaden has been very inconsistent for Evil Geniuses, not only in this split, but over the course of this year so far. There's just been a lot of ups and downs, and while Evil Geniuses, I do think, has looked good over the beginning part of this split, there still are some pretty major question marks in my eyes about what they're going to be able to accomplish, like, just over the whole split. Like, if you're winning games against the worst teams and then getting dominated by the best teams, that's concerning, and that's a team that is middle of the table at best, and this team really has the potential to be better than that. And so when it comes to that number 4 or 5 spot, I just don't know where it's at right now. Fear definitely making their case with this series, but it's one series, and they haven't exactly been the most consistent up until this point. I really want to see them continue this hot streak and continue to play with this kind of aggression. And now moving on to our third and final day here in the NACL in week number 2, and really excited to get into this one. There were a lot of good games on the final day here, and I think we kicked that off with our first bracket of games. We had a weird matchup that I'm going to discuss a little bit, but obviously there are some weird connotations with it. We had Maryville University taking on AoE Gold. Really unfortunate situation here. Lynx, the AD carry for AoE, his power went out, like, right before they were supposed to play the games, and so he couldn't actually play the games today, which is super unfortunate. Will, their starting jungler, ended up role swapping down to AD carry, and one of their coaches, Acadium, who you might remember, he's been playing for forever, subbed in as their starting jungler, and that obviously puts a big wrench into the results of this game because Will was off-rolled and their coach was playing without any practice, and so I don't imagine they were all that prepared to end up playing this series, and they looked like it. They weren't particularly good in this series, but credit to Maryville for being able to take advantage of it. Like I said, though, I'm just not going to try and analyze this too much because there really isn't a lot to take away. Now, there are some positives that I want to talk about on the side of Maryville, some negatives on the side of AoE that don't involve the players that were role swapped, but again, it's just really hard to know what exactly mattered and what exactly didn't. So for Maryville, player of the series for me is pretty obviously going to go to Scary Jerry. The dude absolutely dominated this series. One of the more impressive series, in fact, the most impressive series that he's had at the NACL level. He was going into a role-swapped AD carry, and so not exactly going to say that that was the most difficult series of him to play, but certainly made it count. Was unbelievably good in that game number 2 where it just felt like Maryville had all the pressure all of the time. So Jerry stepping up is going to be big. Obviously, his development's going to be very crucial to what Maryville can do in terms of the rest of this split. They're going to be a relatively good team, but if Jerry can step into being one of the more interesting AD carries, like I think he can, mechanically speaking, then I think that this team does have upside to be potentially top 5, top 6 in the league, which is pretty much exactly where I think they would want to be at this point. Zyko and Niles also were really good in this series. Obviously, Zyko playing really well alongside Scary Jerry, but not a big shock. The bot lane was pretty in favor of Maryville. That was definitely the lane that I think was the most in distress for the side of AoE. And then Niles in the top lane was actually really good, and that's something we'll get back to. Concept has kind of returned to form, I would say, in terms of what he was in 2021, rather than, or I should say 2022, rather than what he was towards the end of last split, where it felt like he stabilized quite a bit. He's just not winning in the 1v1s all that much anymore, and I think Niles was definitely the better top laner in this series, so I want to give him a lot of props for that. But Jerry, Zyko, Niles, even Get Back and Auto Orange, I think, played well in this series. Maryville just looked relatively good, but honestly, they should should have been the better team, especially with the role swaps. And then, like I said, it's hard to judge AoE too much for this loss. They had a role swapped AD carry. They had their coach subbing in at jungle, one of the most important positions in the meta right now. So very difficult stuff. Will is technically going to get my dud of the series here, but again, he was role swapped. He was playing AD carry. He wasn't particularly great at AD carry, was definitely giving over a lot more resources than he should have in this game. But again, laning into an actual NACL caliber bot lane as a non-AD carry, especially someone who hasn't really practiced that role all that much, has got to be an absolute nightmare. And unfortunately, AoE just wasn't able to hold up. So I'm not going to blame Will too much. The players that I am going to call out are the solo laners for AoE. Darkwings and Concept, who both lost individually pretty hard. Darkwings has just not had a good start to the split. Now, obviously, you can talk about jungle pressure not being in his favor, but he really has not been a good laner so far this split, and I think that's been a little bit concerning. That was something he was really good at over the course of his other splits in his career, and so really hoping to see him kind of improve that. I like Darkwings as a player, but it really has been a slow start to summer. And then Concept, like I said earlier, is kind of, I don't want to say regressed, because that's a negative word that I think is too strong for what I'm going for in terms of, you know, what I'm trying to say, but he's just kind of who we thought he was in 2022, a player who, you know, you can win with, is going to have his own little set of pocket picks, but isn't probably going to be the most consistent top laner in the entire league, and someone who I think you do have to at least be a little bit worried about in terms of running it down and not being able to hold up in the 1v1. Hopefully he can get back to that form that he was at towards the back half of Spring Split, where I felt he was a lot more consistent, but right now AoE definitely still has questions, even outside of the fact that their role swap players didn't play great, but hopefully this team is going to be better next week when they actually have their roster. And then Maryville finally picking up their first 2-0 win of the year, probably not the circumstance in which they would have wanted it to happen, but at the very least they took advantage of the opportunity that was placed in front of them, and they looked good doing it. Hopefully this is the sign of a confidence building exercise that they can then move on to carry into next week. And then moving on to our second of the first slate of games here, and it's a battle between two Challengers teams, which is always going to be fun here in the NACL. We had Evil Geniuses Challengers taking on FlyQuest Challengers, and if you were looking for a close series, this one was not it. FlyQuest was definitely the better of these two teams, and Evil Geniuses really do feel like almost exactly like their spring roster did, where it's like, oh, one week they could look really good and they could be competitive against good teams, and then another, they could just get absolutely slammed. And yes, FlyQuest is one of the best teams in the league. They're certainly a team that you have to look out for, but I just would have like to see Evil Geniuses be relatively competitive in this series, and they just weren't. They were definitely the worst of these two teams. But talking about FlyQuest, my player of the series is going to go to Spearaxe in the mid lane, and I'm really excited to say that. Easily the best split that he has played, or the best series that he has played in this split up until this point. I was honestly starting to get worried that I was going to have to put him in the weak link category. Not that I like saying that phrase, because I don't think you can win with a true weak link. I think weak links in League of Legends are a bigger deal than people give them credit for, but I think that Spearaxe is one of those players that was starting to worry me in terms of his upside, but this was a really good series. Yes, it's against a very streaky Evil Geniuses team, but still, having him perform as well as he did, I think was a really good sign, and really having him carry FlyQuest across the finish line in terms of damage, I think was a really good sign. Masu and Winsome were still really good in this series, and if they're going to be able to keep that up, that's going to be massive for this team overall. They're still the best bot lane in the NACL, in my opinion. Arrow and Kimdown are certainly giving them a run for their money in terms of performance right now, but Spearaxe, or I should say Masu and Winsome are definitely talent-wise right up there with anybody, and Winsome honestly had a terrific week in the support position. He's not going to get nearly the credit that he deserves for the kind of impact that he has on the game. Obviously, 2 games of Yuumi, I'm not going to overreact the impact that he's having on this game, but I think Winsome, as people talk about Masu as if he's the only good player in that bot lane, and he's not. Winsome is also incredibly good and arguably more consistent than a player like Masu has been over the course of this year. Not that Masu has been bad, just that Winsome has been really, really, really good, and so really like those 3 players in this series in particular, but for Evil Geniuses, it's just a struggle for them at the current moment. There are just a couple of things consistency-wise that are a problem. My dud of the series is going to go to Ryoma in the mid lane. Spearaxe was significantly better, and this is something we talked about last week, where Ryoma will play 3 series in a week. He'll look really good in 2 of them, or at least pretty good in 2 of them, and really bad in 1 of them. That's the same thing that happened in week number 1, and, you know, I'm not going to try and harp on him too much, but the consistency simply has to improve, especially when he gets behind early. He's somebody who's very streaky in terms of how he plays the game. Talent-wise, he's right up there with any other mid laner in the region, and I do think that he has proved that on tape this split, where he's had a lot of really good games over the course of the split so far, but it's just the bad ones that I think stick out in a lot of people's minds. And I understand why. Like, bad performances, I think, are more memorable than good ones, especially for fans of, like, development and for people who, you know, not to call out audience members for the NACL or anything, but players who I think want Ryoma to fail, or people who want Ryoma to fail because he's a veteran player, somebody who people see as low upside, and they want the young mid laners in. People kind of want him to not be good. I think people overlook some of the good performances, but this was not one of them. This was one of the bad performances. For sure, it was not just him, though. Soul continue to be really bad on the top side of the map. One of the worst players in the NACL this week, just didn't hold up in lane basically to anybody, and he's really taken a big regression ever since his time on TSM. And then Smoothie, I thought was pretty bad, and that's kind of rare. I don't want to say that that's crazy rare, because he was bad last split, and he was pretty bad last year as well, and I was really out on Smoothie moving into this split, but he had been relatively good over the start of this split. Him and King, I think, developed a nice chemistry together, but this was probably his worst series of the year so far, and so definitely unfortunate stuff for Evil Geniuses. There is a way for them to bounce back. There is a way for them to still be relevant, a top 4-ish team, but the inconsistency is definitely something to be concerned about. But FlyQuest is a good team. They're one of the better teams, a top 2 team probably in the entire league at the moment, and Spirax stepped up, and that's really going to be a big difference maker for them. If they can have every lane winning and every lane be a positive instead of just like jungle and bot lane kind of carrying this team across the finish line, FlyQuest is going to be a lot scarier than they are right now. And then moving on to our second slate of games here, we had a really big upset in series number 3. We had Team Fish Taco taking on Team Liquid Challengers, and Taco becomes only the second team in the league to take a game off of Team Liquid. Really good stuff from them, and honestly, I'm not going to come out and say it. I actually, I am. Taco was the better team in this series, and that is as astounding. That is not what I expected at all. Of course, only 2 games, and Liquid was able to take the first one, but Taco was super relevant in that first game. It was very back and forth, and they very much had a chance to be able to win it, and then Game 2 was not close. Like, their win was pretty dominant over a team that had not really lost any games up until this point. Only one in this season so far, and they did it by beating some of their better players, and so very impressed by what we saw out of Taco, and honestly, this is like a defining performance from them as a team. So let's go ahead and go over it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Spawn in the bot lane. This dude is still cracked. I know people forget about Spawn because, he was bad on Dignitas, and or at least on their main roster. He was great on Challengers last year, but he's not exactly the flashiest player, especially early on in laning phase. And then, he goes to Taco, who really didn't have a ton of expectations from the community going into the split, but he's still a premier AD carry at this level. He's probably the best team fighter, period, of any player at this level, and I think he shows that basically every game he gets the opportunity to. Now, problems with Taco have arisen earlier in this split because the team didn't really peel for him as much as they needed to. They would have a really fed AD carry and then just kind of let him die in a lot of team fights, which would be super unfortunate, but it feels like they've cleaned up a lot of those mistakes, and Spawn has done a good job being able to generate his own leads as well, and so really impressed with how he's been able to play. But jungle mid was also just better in this series, which is crazy to say. It was APA and Mir going up against Rosethorn and Onat, and Rosethorn and Onat were better. Like, they were more consistent, especially in that game 2 where it was just awesome coming out from them. Really impressed with what we saw. If they're going to be able to keep that up, I know the inconsistency's kind of there for Rosethorn, that I'm pretty confident in, but Onat's actually surprised me in a very positive way over the start of this split. If those two are going to be a positive for this team, and, a mid-jungle duo that can hang with basically anybody in the league, that completely changes the conversation surrounding Taco. This was a massive win for them, and those 3 players, I think, definitely facilitated it. And then for TL, some good and some bad. Like I said, jungle mid was bad this series. APA is actually going to get my dud of the series here. Was just outplayed by Onat for pretty much every part of this series. Even in game number 1, I felt like APA was significantly weaker, but that game 2 was miserable from him, and it was miserable from Mir as well, and that's kind of shocking. It's almost shocking to the point where I don't want to consider it something to be like looking out for. I think that could just be an outlier for these 2 teams, because I just don't know if you're going to get a bad series like this out of Mir and APA again against a team like Taco. This could have just been an outlier, and that's kind of what I'm hoping, because APA was hot on the trail for being my MVP, I would say, to start this split, and was definitely getting consideration, but this was not a great performance, and definitely something to at least be concerned about. And then I do think that there were positives for this team. I think Arrow still played pretty well and was definitely the most consistent member across this series, but didn't really have a lot of opportunities to do anything. Mostly he just didn't make any mistakes. It wasn't like any major great things. He just kind of capitalized on some of the things that TL would create without really suffering any sort of major drawback for it, which I think when you're losing is a positive trait to have, but unfortunately it's not going to carry that team across the finish line. There were just too many major questions for me to feel comfortable about what Team Liquid was doing in this game, and so very concerned, like in the sense of it shouldn't have happened, but I'm certainly not going to overreact. This is still the best team in the NACL, even if they weren't able to look great against Taco. They still were able to take one game, even when they were on maybe the worst form that I've seen this team on, and so there are still positives to take away, but for Taco, this is about as fantastic of a result as you could ask for. I mean, 2-0 would have been phenomenal, but you were the better team in this series, and you kind of dominated them in game 2. Hopefully this is the kind of confidence-boosting game that you can use to kind of translate this into a potential top 4, top 5 kind of run. I didn't think they had that kind of upside when I was talking about them early in the week, but this is the kind of win that really changes your mind about a team. And then the second of our second slate of games here, we had a very fun matchup that had a lot of build-up to it, a lot of trash talk between these two teams. We had Supernova taking on Cincinnati Fear, of course. Shochi being interviewed, calling out some players that he considers overrated. Music being one of them, Music firing back, saying that this is going to be a fun matchup, really creating a lot of tension and a lot of anticipation for this matchup. And unfortunately for Supernova, Fear is back, baby. They are looking, they are feeling good, and I'm really excited to say that. This team played about as well as you could in a series like this. They were certainly outclassing Supernova in a lot of certain aspects. Also, kind of an underrated aspect, Trevor, facing his former organization, his former team from last split here as well. So just a lot of storylines heading into this, a lot of things to talk about. But for me, I got to start with the bot lane on the side of Fear because they were so good in this series. My player of the series is going to go to JJ. 2 games of Milio, and some people might be saying, how do you give player of the series to somebody who played 2 games of Milio? That champion's insanely busted. But the amount of Milio games that we've seen just not go right, not only in the NACL, but in every region across the world, makes me think that, okay, yeah, you still have to execute on this champion, and we all kind of knew that in the first place, but JJ's just, I'm really glad to see him finding form. I was really worried that Manui and JJ just weren't going to have that kind of chemistry, that kind of synergy, because they didn't really have it in week number 1, but week 2 felt a lot better, especially these past 2 series, and this one was phenomenal from them. To be able to come out and beat what was probably the most consistent part of Supernova over the first couple of weeks in their bot lane as hard as they did both in and out of lane. Super impressive, and obviously I got to give a big shout out to Manui as well, who I think played really, really well. Was definitely, a contender for player of the series, definitely stepped up and did everything he needed to, but of course, got to talk about Perry as well. Was a little bit critical of him and how he had been playing over the first couple of games, but we all kind of knew that he would get back into form eventually, and it really does feel like he is back into form. That series against Evil Geniuses was really good. This series against Supernova was really good. He was by far the better jungler in this series, and that definitely played in. I really do think that Fear is at their best when they're controlling the map, when they're playing to kind of choke out the other team, and I think they did that very well. Obviously, they're great team fighters, and I think that that is something that really amps up this team, but their early games are really consistent. I like Perry. Shochi's been fantastic, and it's really great because I think he's been the best player for this team across this split so far, and so for me to mention him 4th or so on this team in terms of this series when they dominated, that is a really good sign. That shows that it really is more of a team effort. Manui and JJ stepped up this week as a bot lane duo. This team's upside is really starting to show itself again, and I think we're starting to get the version of them that we all kind of wanted to see and kind of expected to see at the start of the split. So not going to overreact, but Fear looking really good here. And then for Supernova, some good and some bad. Again, I know I say that about a lot of teams here, but there isn't anybody who's just been absolutely destroyed. There were some good moments here, and most of them coming in the top lane. I still really like Quacker, and I've been very impressed with what I've seen from him in the top lane. He's honestly been one of the most impressive top laners in the entire region up until this point, and man, if he can keep that up, like, that's huge for Supernova. He honestly feels very similar, and I don't want to compare Supernova to this team, but it feels kind of similar to what a lot of people were saying about Lunacia last split on FlyFam, where there were a lot of problems on the team, especially in terms of consistency, but that top lane has just consistently been a positive and is certainly an upside, kind of position for them. I think it's similar with Supernova. I think Supernova's a better team than what FlyFam was, but still something to keep in mind. Unfortunately, jungle mid was poor again in this series, and it's certainly something that's becoming a little bit of a trend for this team. Dud of the series is going to go to Music. I like Music. Honestly, I think he's shown some good moments in this split, and I liked him going into this split. I thought he had crazy upside. I just didn't really know a whole ton about him, and he certainly didn't have enough film for me to feel confident in saying that he was going to be consistent, but I think the inconsistency is definitely shining through. I think when the rest of this team plays well, Music looks good, and he can generate his own leads, but going into Perry is a little bit of a different beast. His pathing is very good, and he's able to really choke you out in the mid game, and I think Music was just not ready for that. It's unfortunate, but he's going to get my dud of the series. And then Robbie Bob just feels a little bit outclassed at the moment, or at least he did in weeks 1 and 2. Again, like I said for Get Back last week, you can have a bad week and bounce back. There are plenty of players who have played poorly 1 week and then just said, okay, it was 1 week, I got to scratch it from my head and move on. Hopefully Robbie Bob can do that, but it really does feel like mid lane has been a little bit of a weak spot for Supernova over the course of this year. Bot lane ended up losing. It was really just top lane that was kind of the positive. I still like Supernova as a team, but they're maybe not the top 5 or 6 team that I was kind of hyping them up to be midway through the split, or midway through the week, I should say. And then Fear looking great. I mean, I really, really want this team to continue playing like this, and if they do, they're going to skyrocket back up in the power rankings. I only dropped them to number 6 when I think a lot of people wanted them to be lower because I believed in the talent, and I believed that they would be able to turn it around this week again, and I think they absolutely proved me right here. And then moving into our final series of the week here, and this was really the true upset. We had Disguised taking on Wildcard Gaming, and Wildcard not only picks up a win, but they pick up two of them, a 2-0 series win for Wildcard over what a lot of people saw as one of the most dangerous teams in the NACL. They've certainly looked a little bit more bumpy in week number 2 than they did in week number 1, but still some positives to take away from this series for both teams, I would say, overall. But man, Wildcard looking so good, and it's the players you really want to see. As great as like Saligo and Lens and even Donbray are in terms of consistency and, you know, what they're able to offer in terms of game to game, I think that you really want to see the top side of this map step up, because that's your upside. That is like the crazy mechanical upside, at least in my opinion, and man, did they step up in this series. Player of the series for me is gonna go to Zamudo, and that is no brainer to anybody who watched this series. What a series coming out from him. He was really good this week, obviously, saved their series against Maryville with that auction game in day number 2, and then just absolutely decimated Disguised in both games of this in day number 3. Really excited about Zamudo. I know a lot of people were hyping up his mechanics and what he was going to be able to do. Obviously, just returned from playing the Korean solo queue ladder, obviously had a lot of time there, but I mean, man, I was even more impressed with what we saw out of Zamudo at the start of this split than I expected to be. We always get this, like, separation of top laners in the NACL, where it's like the upper top laners are playing really well, the bottom top laners aren't playing as well, and it very much feels like Zamudo has solidified himself in that upper echelon at the current moment, especially mechanically. The dude is not afraid to pull basically any sort of pick out and make it work, but I think he's more consistent at the good, like I shouldn't say the good picks, but the more meta picks than people give him credit for. He's still really good on the things that other people are pulling out. He's just also very creative. It honestly feels like, and I dare say, like an upgrade to Moose Hater. Like someone who is really good at playing meta and is good at playing weak side and can get his own advantages in the 1v1, but not only on his own champions, on things that are, you know, all over the board, including the meta champions. And so really like Zamudo, and I think he's got a big future here in the NACL. And then Keel, I don't know how many times I gotta say it. Keel's really good. I'm really high on Keel. I've always been really high on Keel. And he continues to be a player that I really like at this level. Just consistently wins in the jungle and makes his team look better, whether that's as a carry or whether that's as a facilitator. I think he's arguably the most consistent jungler in the entire region. Maybe not region, but right, the NACL, right, the entire league, and nobody is saying that right now, especially because his champion pool is so wild. But I think Keel is consistently underrated and has always been a positive for this team. But they were the two main players that I wanted to point out on Wildcard. Everybody played well, but it really was the top side that stood out. And then for Disguised, man, 0-2 is definitely an unfortunate turn of events for this team that I think is really just trying to find their footing at this point. They've been fine, but we're kind of expecting better than fine for Disguised up until this point. Fake God was really good in the top lane, and top lane was a lot of fun to watch. Fake God was trying to keep these games alive, but the rest of this map, not so much. Tomio's gonna get my dud of the series here. He definitely got out-jungled by Keel, and that's something that, you know, a lot of players have been out-jungled by Keel, but you would expect Tomio to be one of the few that would be the exception there. Was talking about him earlier this week as one of the most consistent junglers. Well, not in this series he wasn't. He just didn't really have all that much of an impact. He wasn't individually terrible, but he did lose his team a lot of pressure, I would say, throughout this series. And then Young, in that same vein, I think in the mid lane was just not up to the task here. Saligo, somebody who's going to try to neutralize a lot of big plays, and I think he did that very well in this series. Young really couldn't get anything going, and I think that jungle mid not having pressure and not having prio was definitely against the game plan of what Disguise wanted to do. Zazel was also, I should say, just a little bit too aggressive for my taste in the situations where he really didn't have the prio to be. I think that there were situations where Meech could have potentially followed up and didn't, but for the most part, I would say that DSG just looked a little bit disjointed in this series, and hopefully they can figure that out. This team is still crazy talented, and they've shown the flashes of being able to keep up with everybody in this league. They went 1-1 against Liquid, they went 1-1 against FlyQuest, and so this is a team that has been very good against the teams at the top of the standings, but losing 0-2 to Wildcard is definitely going to raise some question marks about this team, and hopefully it's just an outlier and not something we need to be actually worried about. But for Wildcard on the other side, huge win to establish themselves. I was kind of looking down on this team after week number 1 in terms of what they might be able to offer, but I have completely changed my mind with how they played in week 2. Zamudo and especially Keel have looked fantastic. Lens and Donbray look really good as a bot lane, better than Duo King, I would say. And Saligo's a rock in the mid lane, and so I feel pretty good about this team, and I'm hoping that they're going to be able to keep this momentum up for the rest of the split. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL Week 2 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen right now, you're going to see the updated NACL standings after this first week of action. Any ties will just be broken alphabetically, so don't worry, no favoritism there. In the first column to the right, you're going to see my updated power rankings. In the second column, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week. We can go over the biggest risers and the followers, but in general, let's go over the power rankings. Top 2 has shifted a bit. TL, of course, staying at number 1. I don't think that's really all that disputable, but FlyQuest going to jump up to number 2. I think they're definitively the second best team in the league at the current moment, and that means DSG falls to number 3. Now, they're not even really playing like the number 3 best team in the league right now, but I have faith that they'll be able to turn it around and at least get to that spot. I think top 3 is just going to be very difficult for me to make a change for unless one of them completely just starts playing poorly, and I just don't know if that's going to happen with DSG. For now, they just fall to number 3. Number 4 is going to go back to Fear. I know I dropped them to 6 last week, but they're going to jump back up to 4 because I really trust this team to be able to figure it out, and I really like what they've been able to do recently. And in a similar vein, Wildcard's going to jump up to number 5. They feel like the best of the rest right now in terms of, maybe if you include Fear in that, Fear and Wildcard definitely feel like the 2 hottest teams in that department right now. But again, 4 to 8 feel very similar to me in terms of they all can probably take games off of each other. EEG is going to fall to 6. I still like their upside, but man, the consistency is not there. AoE is going to fall to 7. I feel bad, but I am a little bit worried about the solo lane duo of Concept and Darkwings, who just have not been as hot as they need to be, as much as I do think that Will and Breezy have been pretty good to start the split. Taco's going to stay at 8 because, again, I just want them to win a series, but man, taking a game off of Liquid, that's pretty damn good. And then Supernova and Maryville are going to be 9 and 10. They do feel like the 2 most inconsistent teams in the league at the current moment, and so they're going to sit in the spot that I had them there. But overall, I think that it's very much up into interpretation. I think top 3 and bottom 2 are kind of established for me, and everything in the middle can kind of go in any order. So let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, let me know down below as well. But it's time to get into my player of the week and my dud of the week. My player of the week in week number 2 is going to go to Arrow, the AD carry for Team Liquid. I thought he was really, really good in week number 2. Team Liquid continues to prove their dominance, and man, this bot lane is really stepping up and really is the focal point of this Team Liquid team over the beginning part of the split, which I was not anticipating, and so really, really good stuff from them. I think Kim Down's also playing at a really high level, but for me, Arrow is going to get my player of the week. And then my dud of the week, again, another relatively tough decision, but I ended up unfortunately landing on Robbie Bob on Supernova, the mid laner. Just didn't love his week overall. I thought he was not so great in lane and didn't really make up for it all that much in team fights, but he didn't really make any gigantic mistakes. I just feel like he looks a little bit overmatched at the level at the current moment. Again, hopefully he can kind of adjust and get to the form that we know he can be at, but it just has not been a great start for him. And then I think another player that I considered was Soul on Evil Genius's Challengers. Just didn't really love the week that Soul had, but I think a lot of it was EG just kind of falling apart in a lot of different areas. Soul was just a little bit of a scapegoat for it. So my dud of the week is going to go to Robbie Bob, and my player of the week is going to go to Arrow. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below. And of course, if you really did enjoy the video, hit a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We post about the NACL every single week on this channel, but not only the NACL, we cover all 4 of the major regions as well here. And so if you're interested in comprehensive LoL esports coverage every single week on this channel, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, hit that bell, so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.